Hello and welcome to Schlock Tactics. We believe that the B in B-movie should always stand for bad and aim to watch cinema's bottom feeders from the lower half of IMDb so you don't have to. My name is Ash and I'm joined by Mark. Oh, hi Mark.
Oh, hi Ash.
And today we are celebrating the recent wonderful news from the Korean Peninsula that North Korea and South Korea have finally stopped fighting with each other. They're back on good terms, they've shaken hands, held hands, and everything is well again. So we're going to celebrate that by watching two of the finest, or not so fine, kaiju films from North Korea and South Korea respectively. If you don't know what kaiju means, kaiju is a subgenre of monster movie, mostly from Japan, which is basically blokes punching each other while dressed in rubber monster suits. Probably all heard of Godzilla or seen Godzilla. Two films we're going to talk about today are very much inspired by Godzilla and the success of Godzilla in the 50s and the 60s. Now, Mark, you actually haven't seen any kaiju films before, the two we've just watched, have you?
Nope, not one.
This is your first exposure to the kaiju genre, possibly the only Westerner who's seen Pulgasari and Yongarry before Godzilla.
Yes.
What did you think of the genre and the kind of concept of a kaiju film?
It always intrigued me. I wasn't really sure how broad the genre would be, there being a big monster and there being lots of people terrified of it.
It was pretty broad in these two films.
Yeah.
From one to the other. It's usually sci-fi, but not necessarily on these two films.
I was curious as to how a genre could be so broad when there's a monster and lots of people terrified of said monster. Mm-hmm. Interested in seeing how the monster looked, set pieces, things like that.
And also, you understand, obviously you haven't seen Godzilla, but you understand it's a very political film where Godzilla represents nuclear technology and stuff. And we just watched two films where there was also a sort of a political agenda. Less so in one, maybe more so in the other. Quite confused in both. But kaiju films have always been a kind of way for people to get across a political point using a giant rubber monster. Which is great. So, as I mentioned, they're the two films we are going to be reviewing today are Yongarry from South Korea and Pulgasari from North Korea. We'll go for Yongarry first. So this was a film made in 1967, directed by a guy called Kim Ki-duk. Produced in South Korea at the height of Godzilla's success. The original Godzilla came out in 1954, but by the sort of mid to late 60s it was at its absolute height and most family friendly as well. So that is when South Korea decided to jump on the bandwagon and create Yongarry. What were your first impressions of Yongarry? The film or the character?
Both are very pleasing.
Yeah. You could kind of tell that there was meant to be Godzilla, and they haven't seen Godzilla, but you could tell it was meant to be that, couldn't you?
Yeah. I didn't see the monster until quite a way in, which was kind of expecting anyway.
That is kind of common with kaiju films. They hold off on the monster, which is kind of good.
Yeah.
Although it didn't look great when it did finally appear. We'll get onto that. So, really, Yongarry opens, it's sort of centred around a family, really, isn't it? Like a married couple, a little kid called Icho, who's kind of a mischievous little shit in the film, which is kind of a trope of kaiju films, especially in the 60s. A naughty young boy will somehow figure out how to defeat the monster, and he'll know more than all the scientists put together, which is kind of what they did in the 60s with kaiju films.
With a light ray in this film. Yeah,
so in the early portion of the film, he pulls a prank on the newly married couple, or maybe some of the guests. I couldn't figure out who it was, but he shines some sort of light ray on them, and it makes them itch, and that does play into the film later on, doesn't it?
Very briefly.
For comedic effect only, I think. It was I thought it was like the equivalent of a laser pen in more recent years. Basically a little kid with a little device that you could shine on people just to wind them up and be a little shit. So that's our little child character Icho, and he will come up with different ways to annoy people and also save the world from this monster. But the husband in this of the newlyweds, I believe, he's some sort of scientist, some sort of rocket man, and his father-in-law works in the headquarters of the rocket place. I couldn't quite figure out what they were doing. There's quite a lengthy scene where this guy, this scientist, rocket scientist, gets launched into outer space, and this is when you start to see some miniatures come into play.
Yeah.
Because I felt like he was flying through space in like a kitchen funnel, it looked like.
There was a ridiculous rocket at one point I just burst out laughing at.
That was probably the first miniature you've seen, though, if you hadn't seen a kaiju film, so it would look very weird if you hadn't seen that before, but also funny. And it does look like he was floating through space in a funnel. This scene featured the word capsule more than any other scene I've seen in cinema, I think. The guy who had all the dialogue was the father-in-law, and he was just shouting at his son-in-law through the radio, just repeatedly saying, "Capsule, capsule, can you hear me? Capsule, capsule, are you there?" Probably you could just call him by his name, but he wanted to use the word capsule repeatedly, and that kind of annoyed me. But the thing I found most funny about this is that they called this guy in the middle of the night to say, "We need to launch you into space in a rocket," and he was like, "Oh, I've just got married, but
drag you away from your honeymoon."
I think his wife had other ideas, but he was like, "Okay, well, you can launch me into space." And as soon as they launched him into space in the rocket, everyone seemed to sort of go, "What do we do now?"
Yeah,
and they were like, I don't know why they launched him into space. I don't know what they were planning to do when he got up there, but he got up there in his rocket and sort of went, "Oh shit, how do I get back down again?" And the ground control were also saying, "How do we get him back down again?" And I thought they would have thought about this ahead of time.
And his wife just seemed distraught that they couldn't have sex.
She was looking for a different rocket, obviously. So he's floating about in space, sort of. He doesn't seem to know what he's doing for a rocket scientist. He should come back down. So he does land again. But whilst he's in space, sort of super earthquake starts in Korea. Doesn't seem related.
No.
The super earthquake starts. They refer to it as a moving earthquake at one point, which I thought was fun. I thought that was sort of a feature of an earthquake, was that it would move. The super earthquake starts, and this is what initially dislodges Yongarry from wherever he was.
His resting place.
He was sleeping, which does happen in the Godzilla films. Godzilla's usually awoken from some sort of iceberg or volcano or something like that. And this is all complete with, I thought, quite good sci-fi noises and music.
Yeah.
Sort of,
typically ominous, tacky sci-fi noise.
It wasn't quite 50s, it was slightly removed from that, but I still thought it was quite good. There's a scene shortly after this where there's two guys driving in a car. I think during the earthquake they suddenly veer off the road and tumble down the side of a mountain. In which case it immediately cuts to a little tiny toy car catching fire and rolling down the mountain, which I thought really undermined the depth of these people, even though they were bit parts. I thought that was very funny. They were just tumbling down the mountain in a toy car. So shortly after this earthquake starts, I thought it escalated really, really quickly, because all of a sudden they were evacuating the city they were in. There's a guy in the street screaming for everyone to repent.
Oh yeah.
There's buildings kind of crumbling around everyone. There's people falling over en masse all at the same time. Well, I guess what happens when there's an earthquake is everyone falling over at the same time. And then that's when you see the monster interacting with real human beings, and they use the kind of rear projection technique of the 50s, where the monster isn't actually there with the people, but he's the screen on screen. But I thought they had kind of issues with the scale. I couldn't quite tell how big this monster was meant to be, because the people seemed to vary how big the people were and how big he was. So I thought that was kind of inept.
Especially since the buildings were clearly 6-inch tall.
Yeah, the buildings were 6 inches tall. The people were however big people are, and then the monster was being rear projected in the background, so it was kind of difficult to get any kind of sense of scale.
And there was usually close-ups of its tail destroying buildings, but without the rest of it in shot sometimes, which also kind of threw my perspective off as well.
Yeah, it was hard to get a sense of how big this thing was. You'd assume just as big as a Godzilla, but who knows. They also mentioned at this point that careful, he's heading for a well-known Korean landmark. They didn't say what that was.
Didn't specify.
So if anybody knows what that Korean landmark is, please write in and let us know.
I think they mentioned it later, possibly.
Oh, they did mention something about a Pavilion of the Moon.
Yeah.
Is what I heard.
Is that what they were referring to earlier? when they said a landmark.
I don't know what the Pavilion of the Moon is. I don't know if that's a real thing or not.
No.
But it was at this point that Yongarry sort of, again, takes on a Godzilla technique of where in Godzilla he would head for a nuclear power plant and need all of the atomic energy. Yongarry is a bit more old school. He went for an oil refinery and started drinking the oil and eating the gasoline.
Yeah.
And our little hero Icho notices this, and he thinks he can figure out the weakness of the monster. Probably one of the best parts of the film, where he shines his little light ray on Yongarry, and Yongarry starts behaving quite oddly. I'm not sure what was going on here. He was sort of crouching, he was doing a jig, he was having some medical problems.
He was just stumbling about. But it was nice that the light ray from the beginning came full circle and made its way back in.
It's actually a surprising attention to detail that they brought that back.
Yeah.
I think the idea was that he was being made itchy by the light ray, so he looked like he was dancing.
Yeah.
But this is where we started to get a little bit of sympathy for Yongarry, even though he was a terrifying monster that was killing people en masse. He also did like to dance, which we can all relate to. It reminds me of another part from when it was the end of the world. We got a little scene where people were in a nightclub.
Oh yeah.
they were dancing like people
horrendously,
like maybe people did in the 60s. I don't know,
and pouring beer over each other.
Yeah, I think that was just their way of indicating the end of the world and how decadent that would be.
Yeah.
There's people doing weird, like 60s surf rock dancing and pouring beer over themselves. That is... Yeah. And to be fair, not a lot of Godzilla films show what people do when they think they're going to get crushed. They don't show those people at all. So at least it's made an effort to show people thinking it was their last day on Earth. So a group of businessmen were stuffing their faces.
Yeah.
People were going mad in a nightclub, probably shagging and throwing beer on each other. You know,
doing whatever they could.
It's nice to see what people get up to, the little people get up to when a giant monster is smashing through a city, and I guess you would.
Yeah.
So yeah, this eventually leads to the scientists figuring out that in order to take care of Yongarry, they need to manufacture some kind of ammonia solution, an ammonia type powder, which they drop on him from a helicopter. He kind of falls over on a riverbank, and it sort of looks like he shit himself. He's just laying by the river with lots of blood coming out of his arse.
Yeah.
And it's this point we all feel quite sorry for Yongarry, because he's been made to bleed out of the arse into a river by this ammonia powder. And as the kid says, I don't want you to kill him.
No.
I just want you to render him sort of incontinent by the riverside while we rebuild the rest of Korea. So yes, by the end, the little kid thinks, I'd actually liked Yongarry. He was good. He was a good dancer. He killed quite a lot of people, probably. But it's all right now. We've sorted him out.
He could dance.
So there you go. I think pretty much Yongarry, a carbon copy of Godzilla. They didn't really change the design of the creature. They just put a horn on him, which lit up sometimes. Instead of atomic breath, he just had more traditional fire breathing.
You could pretty much see the thing inside of his throat that was spouting out the fire, which is interesting.
I like to think they had a version of the monster that was just a blowtorch with a rubber skin on it.
Yeah.
And someone was just pressing a button at the back, and it's like a novelty lighter you could buy maybe at the time. So yeah, he was very similar to Godzilla in many ways. The plot was very similar to Godzilla in many ways. Very low budget. A good, bad movie. What were your overall thoughts on Yongarry?
Yeah, it was good. There was some ridiculous dancing. Some crazy set pieces.
Yeah.
Tacky.
Some really crazy camera movements as well.
Yeah.
If you noticed in the boardroom, particularly when the generals were sitting around, the camera was swooping from character to character. They didn't really say anything until it got to the end, and then one guy at the end would be like, "Well, I think we should chuck a bomb on this thing, and that's my military opinion if you want it." And then the other person would say, "Well, that's a very clear of you to give your military opinion."
Yeah.
It was very...
some of the panning was off.
It was very clunky exposition. But yeah, the camera movements in this boardroom were wild all over the place. But yeah, that's Yongarry. So next up we have a pretty infamous film called Pulgasari. Now, the background of this film is probably more interesting than the film itself and the plot of the film itself. But for those of you who don't know, Pulgasari was made by the North Korean government in the 80s, and you may be familiar with Kim Jong-il, probably best known for his performance in Team America, but he was also quite high up in the government in the 80s, before he was the president of North Korea. This was still when his father was in charge, Kim Jong-sun. Kim Jong-il at the time was actually just in charge of the state-sponsored film company and media sort of department, so he was in charge of making films. And Kim Jong-il actually loved films, especially American films. He loved Godzilla, he loved Rambo and stuff like that, and he had a bootleg collection, because you actually weren't allowed to watch any Western films in North Korea at the time, but he was allowed to. So eventually he got the reins of the film, state-sponsored film production department, and he wanted to make some films, but he didn't think really the North Korean crews and directors were up to it. So he did what any normal person would do. He found the best director in South Korea, and he kidnapped him, and he kidnapped his wife. In fact, he kidnapped his wife first, so that her husband will come looking for him, and then they kidnapped him as well, and they brought them both to North Korea and put them in a prison camp until they agreed to make propaganda films for North Korea. So they did actually quite a few. They were kidnapped in 1978, made a few films. By the time we got to 1985, that's when they made Pulgasari. Interestingly enough, after they made Pulgasari, they escaped from the North Korean government when they were taking Pulgasari to a European film festival. So in actual fact, the film was only out for a year when they escaped, and Kim Jong-il decided to ban Pulgasari as well as every other film that they had made, because they were traitors. So he put a lot of money and time into making this film, and then immediately banned it because he looked like an idiot, because these people had escaped the government and defected to America. So Pulgasari in North Korea, probably not as popular as it has been in the rest of the world, because they weren't really able to see it for a long time. But we were able to see it, and we did see it. And what were your first impressions of Pulgasari?
Yeah, it was really good. I really like the music. Hit me during the first scene.
It sounded a bit like The Exorcist or something like that.
That was quite noticeably interesting. It was quite majestic. Like the kind of all the buildings and the dress and the king and everything.
Well, this is something that people probably wouldn't expect from a kaiju film, but this was a period piece.
Yeah.
When, you can't possibly say, but sort of samurai times, I would call it. Whenever that was.
They're talking about forges and
smithing.
Like smithing.
Blacksmithing is big in this film, So for whatever reason, Kim Jong-il decided to set this film in the good old days of North Korea, only before communism. It's weird because you do have this score, which is not bad actually. It's a synth score. It's a score from 1985 for a film set probably in 1785 or 1685. It's kind of weird, but I like the kind of the contrast of that was pretty good. But yeah, it is. I think straight away I felt like I was watching Seven Samurai or some sort of Kurosawa film, because we were just straight away in a village with people very energetically blacksmithing. It
was very Kurosawa.
Yeah, it is. It's a very very dumbed down sort of Kurosawa film. I'm guessing Kim Jong-il was a fan of him as well. But we open in a village. Now, what I was confused all the way through, and it will come up a few times probably, is this is a propaganda film made by a communist government.
Yeah.
But I struggled to figure out what they were trying to really get across for most of the film. I mean, it's from the perspective of the working class and the farmers, which I suppose they wanted them to be the heroes.
It definitely got the whole peasants' revolt kind of
they're
thing,
also revolting against the government.
Yeah.
Who I suppose are an imperial government, the king and stuff, but
it's kind of like this royalty thing.
I mean, straight away, 10 minutes in, I was thinking, the governments are bad.
Yeah.
They're really shit, like, we should all rise up against them. But you wouldn't want people in North Korea to think that, so I didn't really fully understand that. It was very sporadic, the propaganda, whatever they were trying to get across, kind of shifted quite a few times. But yeah, it is set in a village with loads of peasants and farmers that the the archetypal kind of working class of the countryside, and then the government or the state, however you want to represent them, turn up and basically start sort of enslaving everyone, beating everyone, imprisoning everyone. Couldn't really figure out why. I think they were supplying bandits in the hills, or they were making weapons and they should have been farming.
There was a shortage of farming tools or something.
I couldn't really figure it out, but I'm assuming they were being too communist, and that was, they were trying to do too much farming and too much agriculture. But they enslaved this old blacksmith guy, and just before he dies, he grabs basically some rice and some shit in his prison cell and rolls it into a ball, and that is how Pulgasari is created in a very strange way.
And it started off like human-sized, and then
It is interesting, and I'm assuming it's had a much bigger budget than Yongarry, because it was made by the government, and that's a pretty big budget. But it did start off as a sort of a little... it started off as a 3-foot tall creature, like a little dog, and it grew and it grew and it grew. They must have gone through about 7 or 8 different sizes before it got to what kaiju size you would expect it to be. I should mention as well, the effects in this were really good because Kim Jong-il also managed to get the people from Toho to come and do the special effects, Toho being the people that created the Godzilla effects and the Godzilla suits. He tricked them into doing the special effects by telling them he was making a film in China, and so they got on a plane, and then the plane didn't land in China, it landed in North Korea. And they realised that something weird was going on, but they were there then, so they just decided to do it anyway. So the effects in this film are really good and better than Yongarry, because they are done by Toho, who did the Godzilla effects, and they know what they're doing. So you can't fault the effects or the direction in Pulgasari because of that. He got the best personnel he could. Like he said, there wasn't the talent in North Korea. He had to get some talent from South Korea and Japan and stuff. So it's definitely a lot of talent and skill behind the film. It's just a weird plot, mainly. Straight away we establish that Pulgasari, in one of my favourite quotes of the film, it likes metal.
He eats swords.
He loves metal and iron, and this is based on a North Korean folklore tale that Pulgasari is an actual folklore thing that eats iron, but they straight away established that they was going to eat your swords and your needle and thread initially, and all those sorts of things. So that struck me straight away as a pretty weird characteristic for a monster to eat metal. Not necessarily attack anyone, at least initially. It just wants to eat all your metal. Weird. Again, maybe some sort of propaganda message I wasn't getting. It seemed quite pacifist in a way, because it kept eating all the weapons so people couldn't fight each other. That's Pulgasari. He's a good guy. So next, as far as I can remember, either the government moved in a lot more, or perhaps the film switched to some sort of fortress place, because there was all of a sudden a lot more people. There were some really great hats in this film. You might have noticed the one guy that had a sort of a mortarboard type hat, but with some like beaded curtains hanging off the front, which I thought was great. And then his general had some sort of weird Viking type hat. There's a really funny scene where they were smacking an old woman in the shins repeatedly. I'm not sure why. Perhaps they thought it wouldn't be gentlemanly to hit a woman anywhere else, so they had a big bat and they were smacking her in the shins so that she would give up some information about because some of the blacksmiths had gone up into the hills now, hadn't they, to join forces with the bandits, and they were planning to come back down and take over the government, take over the city,
teaming up.
And by this point Pulgasari, they keep feeding him the swords and stuff, like you say, and the weapons. Ironically, they have to give all their weapons to this monster so that he can be their weapon, but now they won't have anything to fight with. That was a bit weird. I think because they're blacksmiths, they could make way more stuff anyway, so it didn't really matter, I guess. What happens next is that they set a trap for Pulgasari by kidnapping the blacksmith's daughter, and then they kind of trap him in a massive cage, and sort of Wicker Man-esque, they set fire to it, and they all think that they've killed Pulgasari. But he came out of it sort of red and molten, which reminded me of kind of molten Godzilla from the mid-90s, but he had to dip himself in the water like a sword. Did you get that? Yeah. He was heated up, and he was metal, and then he was cooled again.
See.
So that's what they did there. But then they started pulling out all of this. It got really... I felt it got really historically inaccurate really quickly, because they appeared to pull out all this modern artillery, these sort of missiles.
They started firing missiles at him, and they were just like bouncing off of him and not doing anything, which was quite amusing.
Which I thought they'd already established that would have happened, but they kept doing it anyway.
And then later they developed this weapon that they said could destroy 104 Pulgasaris. or they said something like even 104 Pulgasaris couldn't.
Yeah.
Or something along those lines.
This was this big cannon.
I was like, such a strange, peculiar number.
It was a very specific number of Pulgasaris, considering they couldn't even kill one.
Yeah.
The 104 would have been fine, and once they got this cannon loaded up. But this cannon seemed to be some sort of very modern missile launcher. That they actually also said it would turn a mountain into ash, and then immediately they fired something at a mountain, and it just made a little puff of smoke. So I thought they set themselves up for a fall there. So yeah, they got these big cannons. They started launching these things at Pulgasari. They thought they could kill it. They thought they could kill 104. But guess what? They didn't.
No.
And all the while, this governor guy, he didn't really have much dialogue. He just kept going, That's all he ever really did.
Yeah.
Evil cackling and evil...
Probably some more crazy panning as well across that.
Probably, yes. But I thought the weirdest thing about this film was kind of the third act, because the object of the whole film is to get Pulgasari and the peasants to defeat the bad government and the bad imperial people, and they do that, and the film carries on for about another 20 minutes.
Yeah,
because all of a sudden Pulgasari is a threat to the farming people.
Yeah.
Now, if this is your propaganda film where Pulgasari is a tool of the proletariat and the farmers, then it makes no sense at all for him to all of a sudden turn on them.
It's just completely flipped the other way.
Yeah. So the idea being that the farmers represent the sort of normal working people of North Korea, and the government represent the old monarchy. Then what is Pulgasari meant to represent? Capitalist, metal-munching monster? Yeah. I don't know what the point of that was. It kind of undermined the rest of the film, because I thought the idea was that Pulgasari was a tool of the communist and the working class, and then he just kind of turned on them. I don't know what happened.
Slightly disappointed that it kind of undermined the whole, like you said, the whole being on the side of the working class.
And then they couldn't kill him; he was invincible. And then the woman, the blacksmith's daughter, just says, "Oh, Pulgasari, I'd like it if you could leave this world now." And he just shatters and turns to dust.
Yeah. And
then little Pulgasari comes back, and then she sheds a tear. And that's the end.
Some bit where it got wrapped up in curtain and then quickly stomped on.
Oh, that was the governor. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was in his mansion, and Pulgasari was smashing it from the outside. So he thought, in order to protect himself, he would wrap himself in a yellow curtain.
Yeah.
That didn't work.
That was a strange scene.
Yeah, but what I did like about Pulgasari, I mean, it's obviously a much better made film than Yongarry and a much bigger budget, but I thought Pulgasari, the monster, looked really good.
Yeah, it did, yeah.
It was like a heavy metal bull. It could have been on a Judas Priest album cover or something. It looked badass.
Yeah.
And all these shots of him stomping towards a city, just looking like a badass heavy metal bull about to kick the shit out of all these people in silly hats.
Yeah.
That's the film in a nutshell, really.
I could definitely take Pulgasari more seriously than Yongarry in terms of the monster, the way they did.
He looked better. He was made of metal. He had all these cool... He didn't have any... I don't suppose he didn't have any powers, but he was invincible, which is a good power. And he was able to eat metal and explosives and weapons and become more powerful. So he was like a living weapon, but massive.
Yeah.
Oh, it was a good idea, good design. Yeah, a lot of people talk about Pulgasari as being a bad film, and I suppose it is, but I think that's a really good creature, and I kind of wish that creature had been created by someone else, so we could have got more Pulgasari films, but we can't, because owned by North Korea, I suppose you're not allowed to do that. Your overall thoughts on Pulgasari, then? What did you think?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Yeah, it had some interesting themes, the whole sort of working class versus the imperial thing that we talked about.
Mm.
But like you said, I was a bit disappointed where the Pulgasari started turning on the working class, and it kind of threw my perspective of everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, Pulgasari as an actual monster was really cool.
I think better appreciated taking the whole political agenda out of it.
Yeah.
If you didn't know it was made by a communist state government, you probably would enjoy it more, not trying to constantly figure out what the political agenda is.
Yeah.
And just enjoy a big monster smashing stuff up, which is what kaiju should be.
I think the narrative was generally better than Yongarry. I was going to say the dialogue was probably better, but that was probably helped by the fact that we watched it in Korean and it wasn't dubbed.
So for listeners like that, you can watch Yongarry and Pulgasari both for free on YouTube, but Yongarry is dubbed and Pulgasari is subtitled. And I always think that bad films are made so much badder or better by having some dubbing, having some Americans do the funny voices on the top. So I think Pulgasari would have been a lot funnier and cheesier if that had been dubbed. Might have liked it even more again, but I think it was ambitious.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth noting that both films cash in on the success and popularity of Godzilla, except Pulgasari was 30 years late. So, North Korea being the kind of insular state didn't get around to knocking off Godzilla for 30 years, but it was well timed with the film that Toho released in 1984, The Return of Godzilla, and apparently Kim Jong-il claimed that he was basing it on that film, not any of the other 15 Godzilla films that have come before.
Yeah.
Are you going to argue with Kim Jong-il?
No.
Can't anymore. He's dead. But hopefully Kim Jong-un will make his own Pulgasari or something similar one day, especially now that the country's becoming
that would be amazing.
More friendly, more open to Western influences, hopefully again. I think it's time for another Pulgasari or something similar. Or another Yongarry. Actually, looking it up, they did remake Yongarry in the late 90s, which we haven't seen, but it looked a bit more serious, which I'm not up for. So there is Yongarry and Pulgasari, both available to watch on YouTube, both bad films in the best possible way. If you did like either of these films, if you've watched them or you like the sound of them, obviously we would recommend the original Godzilla, any of the Godzilla films really from the 50s and 60s, Godzilla vs. Hedorah, that seemed quite influential on both of these films as well. The Gamera films were the rival to Godzilla within Japan, they're all really good as well. So yes, that has been our Korean Kaiju face-off, Yongarry versus Pulgasari. Mark, who would you say came off the better in this most recent Korean war?
Pulgasari, I suppose.
Yeah?
Yeah. You?
I tend to agree, just because it was more original, more ambitious. Yongarry was great, but it was just a Godzilla rip-off, and there are loads of Godzilla films if you want to watch Godzilla films. So, I agree. Pulgasari is the better bad film. It's slightly more insane, and it's a really interesting story, which I think everyone should read up on, as well as watch the film. So that's been the very first episode of Schlock Tactics. If you would like to comment on either of these films, if you've seen them, let us know what you think. If you'd like to ask us any questions, you can do that. And that has been the first episode of Schlock Tactics. My name is Ash, and I'm joined by Mark.
Hello.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
And we'll hopefully catch you next time. Bye.
Bye.